In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. At first, most reckoned with a war measured in weeks, maybe months at most. This conflict is about to begin year 3, and more people are reckoning that time is running out for Ukraine. A new survey among Europeans shows most still want Ukraine to win the war. Most say it won't happen. Tonight, high hopes and low expectations. I'm Brent Goff in Berlin. This is The Day.
In terms of support for Ukraine, we are working with our European partners to adapt our sanction packages and keep up the pressure on the Russian war machine.
We are considering all options to hold Russia and Putin to account, and this morning we sanctioned those running the prison where Alexei Navalny's body still lies.
I told you we'd be announcing sanctions on Russia. We'll have a major package announced on Friday.
Also coming up, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought war back to Europe, a conflict too close for comfort. You would think.
Call it not as a conflict, but the war. Now my message to our partners, please don't call it support of Ukraine, because this is not support. Please call it investment in your own security.
Well, to our viewers watching on PBS in the United States and to all of you around the world, welcome. We begin the day with sanctions against Russia yet again. Today, the European Union agreed to impose a 13th round of sanctions against Russia. It comes as the Kremlin's war against Ukraine nears its second anniversary. And it comes as Ukrainian forces are suffering losses like never before on the battlefield. After months of heavy fighting against Russian forces, Ukraine's military recently withdrew from the eastern town of Avdiivka, a major loss for Kyiv. This unverified Russian video purports to show Russian soldiers there replacing the Ukrainian flag with their own. Europe's latest round of sanctions also come amid public outrage over the death of Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny inside a Siberian prison just last week. Well, Europe has decided on more sanctions against Russia, the right response at the right time. I put that to Professor Jeffrey Sonnenfeld. He's Associate Dean at the Yale School of Business Management.
It is needed. We've had various warning shots over the bow of increasingly stiff sanctions, and yet there's still more that has to be done. We alone had a lot to do with catalyzing the historic exit of 1,200 major multinationals to leave Russia. That's 6 times the retreat from South Africa in protest of the apartheid regime. And there are all kinds of sanctions, of course, as we know, in financial sector and some other sectors, but there's not enough. And this is, I think, going to be very effective. The oil price caps were pretty strong, but this will do even far more.
Professor, you will certainly understand there is a level of cynicism, though, among the public. This is the 13th round of sanctions that the European Union has slapped against Russia. How many rounds of sanctions will it take to get the desired outcome?
Well, it'll take a lot more, and it isn't like giving one weapon system either is going to do it. So please, I hope any cynical viewers keep in mind that the Leopard tanks from you folks or the Abrams tanks from here aren't going to do it alone. The HIMARS systems weren't going to do it alone. The F-16s weren't going to do it alone. The various kinds of Patriot missile systems and things provide protection and defense. But just like we need multiple weapon systems and now they're short on artillery, we also need a lot tighter sanctions. The sanctions have been very effective. What your viewers have to understand is Putin is concealing his economic statistics from the International Monetary Fund, from the IMF. Their own economists have told us at the IMF, and we have it recorded, that they don't know how the Russian economy is doing. They're only taking his made-up propaganda, his statistics, and repackaging it. And Putin wakes up in the morning and comes up with a fake GDP. The Russian economy is hemorrhaging. Every sector is down from 60% to more than 90%. They have zero foreign investment going into it. They had over $100 billion a year of foreign direct investment going in there. We know that that over a third of their millionaires have fled. The economy is in distress, but he's surviving because he's cannibalizing industry. And now this economy used to be 25% state controlled. It's now 70% state controlled. And he uses it as his cookie jar. He's mortgaging Russia's future.
That may be the case, Professor, but it doesn't change the fact that these sanctions have not brought this war to an end, and that is what everyone is waiting to happen.
Well, they need even more. There are chips that get through. There are military-grade chips that even an ambassador from just between we friends, Uzbekistan, admitted to us, gets basically taped onto refrigerators and microwave ovens as household appliances that get imported into Russia that are actually harvested and used for military-grade uses. There are chips coming through Russia, chips coming through China, and those have to be tightened. The oil sanctions, Russia is not making money on oil. You hear about a volume of oil. Their profits have plunged. In fact, they're producing at break-even levels. Mm-hmm. And today's Financial Times reports what we said would happen 2 years ago, which is that Gazprom is basically virtually out of business. Nobody can buy their gas. Right. You guys don't need it. The EU needs none of it. And he can't pivot and sell it to Asia. But there is still some slippage. We have aluminum is being bought. We have billions of dollars of aluminum, $10 billion of aluminum being bought by the EU. That should stop. $2 billion of titanium and things. That can be brought to a halt. And that's what these new sanctions will tighten, I think, the sanctions even more than and better enforcement on I think, some of the oil price caps would help.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be watching to see if this round will do the trick. Professor Jeffrey Zollenfeld, we appreciate your time and your valuable analysis tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, since February of 2022, the European Union has banned goods worth about 44 billion euros that would have been exported to Russia. Now, these include advanced technologies such as radar systems, drones, camouflage gear or weapons, and luxury items loved by Russia's elite. On the imports side, the sanctions may hit even harder. Russian commodities worth 91.2 billion euros are now banned across Europe, and that includes coal, iron, gold, and steel, as well as Russia's most iconic and coveted products, vodka and caviar. Here's a look now at how Russia's economy is doing under the penalties already in place.
The defence industry is currently the most important pillar of the Russian economy. Thanks to significantly increased government spending, the defence industry accounts for 10% of GDP. Other sectors, such as the steel industry, are also benefiting. After the slump in 2022, the Russian economy is now growing, according to data from Moscow. Growth is also forecast for 2024.
Was gerade passiert ist, dass sich eigentlich Russland
What's happening is that Russia is actually, ironically, becoming more like the Soviet Union, in that it has high spending on the military and, in some cases, heavy industry, and at the same time the level of consumption is falling for the population.
But industrial production is also doing surprisingly well, for example, in the automotive sector. Components are increasingly coming from China after the Europeans withdrew from Russia. Thanks to Chinese imports, the Russian economy is being kept afloat.
China is, of course, not officially participating in the sanctions, so it is not a partner, so to speak, of Western states when it comes to sanctions.
To finance imports, Russia needs export income from gas sales. These have fallen dramatically at times. The EU's extensive import ban seems to have had an effect. Tapping into new customers with new pipelines is only a partial substitute.
The volumes involved with the pipelines are very, very different when you compare them, for what the pipelines can transport to the EU or can transport to China. And even the new infrastructural projects like Power of Siberia 2 are still in the infant state.
However, oil sales, Russia's second most important source of export revenue, are almost as good as before the war in Ukraine. This is despite EU sanctions aimed at enforcing a price cap of $60 a barrel.
Transportation of oil probably are violating the cap. So there is weak enforcement on the side of authorities. There is also shadow trading where oil is discharged and charged on another vessel overseas.
More and more oil is ending up in India. Its most important oil supplier is now Russia. Nevertheless, Russia's growth is partly financed on credit, including military spending. How long can Putin actually afford to do this?
You can ride that for quite a while. Russia had a very low debt level at the beginning of the war. It still has a low debt level even now.
Russia does not look set to run out of money to finance the war in Ukraine anytime soon.
Well, 2 years into Russia's war on Ukraine, and public opinion regarding the conflict here in Europe does not translate into a message of optimism. In fact, the majority of Europeans are pessimistic about a Ukrainian victory. A survey by the European Council on Foreign Relations says only 1 in 10 think Ukraine can win. 20% believe Russia will win. The Berlin-based think tank says that 41% of respondents want Europe to pressure Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. 17,000 people in 12 European countries took part in this survey. Well, for more now, I want to bring in Raphael Loss from the European Council on Foreign Relations. Raphael, it's good to see you again. 1 year ago, it looked like Ukraine might be able to turn this war around with its counteroffensive. That didn't happen. So I'm wondering, how does this new survey, how does it differ from numbers we may have seen 1 year ago?
My organization, the European Council on Foreign Relations, polled again 12 European countries' populations about their attitudes and views of Russia's full-scale invasion and the war in Ukraine going now into the third year. I think Europeans are not feeling particularly heroic about the war. Neither are they particularly enthusiastic about Ukraine's prospects, but also they doubt Europeans' ability to backfill the U.S. leadership role and military aid to Ukraine in case Donald Trump is reelected to the White House this November.
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack there. Let me start with this notion of war fatigue. You say that this fatigue is crucial to Vladimir Putin's calculations for winning in Ukraine. I'm wondering, how war-weary is Europe, is the West right now?
I think certainly we see a rise in war weariness. Despite inflation in Europe going back to pre-war levels, despite energy prices going back to pre-war levels, European populations feel anxious about Ukraine's prospects, and I think that has an effect on how likely they view a Ukrainian victory and how promising they see continued US and European aid towards Ukraine. They don't think that a Ukrainian victory is particularly likely, but on the other hand, they also don't want to appease Russia and Vladimir Putin. They don't think that peace on Russian terms is any sustainable.
Yeah, so it seems the message here is, in Europe, we don't want Russia to win, but we think it probably will. Considering that, what should European leaders, what should they do with this knowledge? I mean, how should this new survey, how should it shape policy?
Most Europeans believe that this war will end in some kind of negotiated settlement. And this is certainly true from an analytical perspective. Most wars do end in negotiated settlements. But the fact also is that those negotiated settlements usually reflect the military balance of power on the battlefield. And so in order to sustain European countries' military aid, financial aid to Ukraine, to keep Ukraine in the fight, to avoid a Russian victory in this war, European leaders need to rephrase the support effort, and they have to strengthen the message of peace on international law terms, of avoiding a peace on Russian terms that would equate to a surrender of Ukraine.
Yeah, you say in your survey that leaders need to define the meaning of a durable peace. They say that may be the goal here. What do you mean by that, a durable peace?
A durable peace, in our view, is one that builds on international law and international humanitarian law. The Swiss government, for example, is engaged in an effort to bring together a large coalition of countries supporting Ukraine's peace formula, which recognizes the territorial integrity of the country, which recognizes its political sovereignty, and it calls on the global community to also stand behind international law in order to sustain a future peace agreement and to not give Russia another opening, such as the Minsk 1 and 2 agreements that we saw in 2014, 2015, to manipulate the national politics of Ukraine and to undermine Ukraine's Western trajectory.
What do Europeans think should happen if U.S. support for Ukraine flags? And in the event of Donald Trump, for example, winning another presidency, what do they think should happen?
Europeans seem to doubt that they are able by themselves to backfill what the US is providing in material support to Ukraine, but also in political leadership to bring together this large international coalition of supporters that we've seen emerge, for example, in the context of the Rammstein contact group. But they're also not willing to let Ukraine go. A plurality of Europeans think that they should either maintain or even increase support in case a future U.S. government decides to step out of this international coalition.
And can we see in this new survey, pockets of increased support for Ukraine and pockets where the support is waning, possibly even more pro-Putin, pro-Russia?
European views certainly differ between countries, but they also differ within countries. Sometimes the differences between political parties is larger than those between European countries. But you're right to point out that certainly some countries, governments and populations take a more relatively pro-Russian view, including, for example, Hungary. Greece is also more doubtful than other countries. On the other side, we have Sweden, traditionally also Poland, as a very strong supporter of Ukraine's defensive struggle. But interestingly, some lingering doubt in Eastern European countries about what the large populations of Ukrainian refugees might mean for national cohesion.
Raphael Loss with the European Council on Foreign Relations here in Berlin. Raphael, as always, it's good to have you on. We appreciate you walking us through these new numbers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.